You wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing from a dream you can't quite remember. But the feeling lingers. That familiar ache of not being enough, of needing approval, of carrying a weight that doesn't belong to you. You've tried therapy, read countless self-help books, changed cities, jobs and relationships, yet somehow you keep finding yourself in the same emotional patterns, making the same choices that leave you feeling empty and disconnected. What if I told you that the key to your freedom lies not in changing your external circumstances, but in understanding an invisible blueprint that was imprinted on your psyche long before you could speak? What if the voice in your head that tells you you're too much or not enough isn't actually your voice at all, but an echo from your earliest relationship, the one with your mother? Carl Jung, one of the most profound explorers of the human psyche, understood something that modern psychology often overlooks. We don't just carry memories of our childhood experiences. We carry the living, breathing psychological patterns that were formed in those early years. These patterns, which Jung called complexes, operate like autonomous programs running in the background of our consciousness, shaping our choices, our relationships, and our very sense of self. The mother complex is perhaps the most powerful of all these patterns because it forms the foundation of how we learn to love, trust, and exist in the world. But here's what makes this so challenging. It's not just about your personal mother as an individual human being. It's about the archetypal image of mother that lives in your unconscious. An image that was shaped by your earliest experiences but now exists independently, influencing your life in ways you may never have recognized. This is not a story about blame or victimhood. Your mother, like all mothers, was a human being doing her best with the tools she had, carrying her own wounds and unconscious patterns from her childhood. This is a story about awareness, about understanding the hidden forces that have been guiding your life from the shadows, and about reclaiming your power to write your own story. Today, we're going to journey into the depths of this psychological territory that Jung called the personal unconscious. We're going to explore how the mother complex forms, how it manifests in adult life, and most importantly, how to transform it from an unconscious prison into conscious wisdom. This journey requires courage because it means facing parts of yourself you may have spent a lifetime avoiding, but on the other side of this confrontation lies something precious, the freedom to be authentically yourself. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Love. How the mother complex forms. Before you had language, before you had conscious memory, your nervous system was learning what love meant. In those first months and years of life, your mother's face was your first mirror, her voice was your first teacher, her presence or absence was your first lesson in what you could expect from the world. Jung understood that these early experiences don't just create memories, they create what he called archetypal patterns in the unconscious. The mother archetype is universal, appearing in every culture and throughout history as the symbol of nurturing, protection, creation and life itself. But your personal relationship with this archetype was shaped by the specific woman who mothered you, with all her strengths, limitations, fears, and unconscious patterns. Think of it this way. Imagine your psyche as a house being built. The mother complex is like the foundation. It determines the basic structure, the way everything else is arranged, even the kinds of problems that will emerge years later. If that foundation is stable and supportive, the house can weather many storms. But if it's uneven, cracked, or built on unstable ground, every subsequent layer will be affected. But here's what makes this so complex. Even loving, well-intentioned mothers can leave psychological imprints that become problematic later. Maybe love was conditional on being good or achieving certain standards. Maybe emotions were unwelcome, so you learned to hide your feelings. Maybe your mother was overwhelmed by her own life, so you learned to take care of others instead of expressing your own needs. Maybe she was overprotective, so you never learned to trust your own judgment. Maybe she was absent, physically or emotionally, so you learned that love meant longing for what you couldn't have. None of these scenarios require a bad mother. They simply require a human mother, operating from her own wounds and limitations, in a culture that doesn't truly understand what children need for healthy psychological development. The tragedy is not that this happens. It's that most of us never recognize it's happened. So we spend our adult lives unconsciously recreating these early patterns. Jung observed that the mother complex typically manifests in one of several ways. Some people idealize the mother figure, never able to see her as human, always seeking to recreate the perfect love they believe they once had. Others demonize her, blaming her for everything that's wrong in their lives, never recognizing their own agency. Still others seem to have gotten over their childhood, never recognizing how deeply these early patterns still influence their choices. But the most insidious manifestation is what Jung called invisible loyalty, an unconscious commitment to repeating the mother's patterns, even when they're painful. This loyalty operates beneath consciousness, compelling us to recreate familiar dynamics even when we consciously want something different. We choose partners who treat us the way she did. We develop the same fears and limitations she had. We even adopt her way of speaking to ourselves, her voice becoming our inner critic. The formation of the mother complex is not a conscious process. It happens through what psychologists call implicit memory, the body's remembering of emotional states, nervous system patterns, and relational dynamics that occurred before explicit memory was fully online. This is why you might find yourself reacting to situations in ways that feel completely irrational, or why certain types of people trigger responses that seem disproportionate to the actual circumstances. Your nervous system learned in those early years what safety felt like, what love looked like, what you needed to do to get your needs met, and what happened when you didn't. These lessons got encoded not just in your mind, but in your body, in the very patterns of your breathing, your muscle tension, your digestive system, and your immune response. Understanding this can be both liberating and overwhelming. Liberating because it explains so much about patterns you may have been struggling with for years. Overwhelming because it reveals how deeply these patterns run, and how much of what you thought was you might actually be inherited programming. But Jung's great insight was that once these patterns become conscious, they lose much of their power over us. The first step in healing the mother complex is recognizing it exists, seeing how it operates in your life, understanding its origins, and beginning to separate what is truly yours from what you inherited. Chapter 2. The Shadow Mother. Understanding the dark side of the maternal archetype. In Jung's psychology, every archetype has both light and shadow aspects, and the mother archetype is no exception. While we often think of mothers only in terms of nurturing and protection, Jung recognized that the same energy that gives life can also consume it. That the same love that protects can also control and suffocate. The shadow mother is not necessarily a bad mother. She's the aspect of the maternal archetype that operates from fear, control, and unconscious patterns. She might manifest as the mother who loves too much, who can't let go, who lives through her children's achievements. She might be the mother who withdraws love when disappointed, who uses guilt as a weapon, who makes her children responsible for her emotional well-being. She might be the mother who is so overwhelmed by her own pain that she can't see her children as separate beings with their own needs and feelings. What makes the shadow mother so powerful is that her influence often masquerades as love. I'm only thinking of your best interests. I worry because I love you. After everything I've done for you. These phrases carry the energy of the shadow mother, using love as a form of emotional manipulation or control. Jung understood that children have no choice but to adapt to whatever mothering they receive. If love comes with conditions, they learn to meet those conditions. If emotional expression is dangerous, they learn to suppress their feelings. If their mother needs them to be strong, they learn to hide their vulnerability. If their mother is overwhelmed, they learn to minimize their needs. These adaptations are survival strategies, but they become prisons when they persist into adult life. The shadow mother doesn't just live in the external relationship with your actual mother. She becomes internalized as a voice in your head, a set of rules about how love works, a collection of fears about what happens when you disappoint others. She might show up as the voice that tells you you're being selfish when you set boundaries, that criticizes you for wanting too much, that makes you feel guilty for your successes or ashamed of your failures. One of the most common manifestations of the shadow mother complex is what Jung called psychological incest, not sexual, but emotional. This occurs when the boundaries between mother and child become blurred, when the child becomes responsible for the mother's emotional well-being, when love becomes enmeshed rather than free. Children in these situations learn that love means sacrifice, that their worth depends on how well they take care of others, that having their own needs is a form of betrayal. The shadow mother also appears in our adult relationships in the form of projection. We might find ourselves attracted to people who carry the same emotional energy as our mother. Perhaps their unavailability, their neediness, their critical nature, or their tendency to make us feel small. Or we might find ourselves playing out the shadow mother role, becoming controlling, manipulative, or emotionally demanding with others. Jung observed that many people spend their entire lives either rebelling against the shadow mother or submitting to her, never recognizing that both responses keep them trapped in the original dynamic. The rebel thinks they're free because they do the opposite of what their mother wanted, but they're still being controlled by her image. The compliant person thinks they're loving because they continue to please and appease, but they've never learned to love freely. The shadow mother is also connected to what Jung called the terrible mother archetype, the mythological figure who appears in stories across cultures as the witch, the devouring monster, the seductive destroyer. These are not literal descriptions of any individual mother, but symbolic representations of the shadow side of maternal energy that exists in the collective unconscious. Recognizing the shadow mother is challenging because it requires seeing past the stories we tell ourselves about our childhood. Many people resist this work because they believe that acknowledging the shadow aspects of their mother's influence means they're being disloyal, ungrateful, or cruel. But Jung understood that psychological health requires seeing the whole truth, not just the comfortable parts. The shadow mother is also connected to our relationship with the feminine principle itself. For men, an unhealed mother complex often manifests as fear of feminine energy, difficulty with emotional intimacy, or the tendency to either idealize or demonize women. For women, it might manifest as competition with other women, difficulty accessing their own power, or the tendency to suppress their feminine qualities in order to feel safe in the world. Healing the shadow mother doesn't mean rejecting or hating your actual mother. It means recognizing the difference between the person your mother was and the archetypal energy she carried. It means understanding that her shadow behaviors likely came from her own unhealed wounds and unconscious patterns. And most importantly, it means refusing to continue carrying those patterns in your own psyche. The goal is not to eliminate the mother archetype. That would be impossible and unhealthy. The goal is to bring consciousness to it, to separate what serves you from what enslaves you, and to develop a relationship with the maternal energy that is based on choice rather than compulsion. Chapter 3. The Voice Inside Your Head. How the Internal Mother Operates. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of the mother complex is how it becomes internalized as what Jung called the internal mother, a psychological structure that continues to operate long after you've left your mother's house. This internal mother is not your actual mother. It's a composite of her voice, her values, her fears, her expectations, and her way of relating to the fabric of your own psyche. The internal mother speaks to you every day, though you might not recognize her voice as separate from your own thoughts. She's the one who tells you that you're being too emotional when you cry. She's the one who makes you feel guilty for taking time for yourself. She's the one who criticizes your choices, minimizes your achievements, or warns you about dangers that may not actually exist. She's also the one who might push you to achieve more, do better, be perfect. Not out of support for your authentic self, but out of an unconscious need to fulfill her unfulfilled dreams. Jung understood that this internal mother operates like an autonomous complex, a semi-independent psychological entity that has its own agenda, its own intelligence, and its own methods of influencing your behavior. You might find yourself making decisions that you can't fully explain, avoiding opportunities that would be good for you, or repeating patterns that you've consciously decided to change. This is often the internal mother at work, operating from beneath the threshold of consciousness. The internal mother is particularly powerful because she uses the language of care and protection to maintain control. She might say things like, "I'm just trying to keep you safe," or "I only want what's best for you," but her real function is to keep you from growing beyond the emotional age at which she was formed. She fears your independence because it threatens her existence. She fears your success because it might mean you no longer need her. She fears your happiness because it challenges her belief that life is inherently dangerous or disappointing. One of the most common ways the internal mother maintains control is through guilt. This is not the healthy guilt that arises when we've actually done something wrong, but the neurotic guilt that Jung called existential guilt, the feeling that our very existence is somehow a burden to others. This guilt makes us apologize for taking up space, for having needs, for expressing our truth, for being successful, or for being happy when others are not. The internal mother also operates through what Jung called identification. This means that you unconsciously take on her emotional states, her worldview, and her behavioral patterns as if they were your own. You might find yourself becoming anxious about things that worried her. Even if they don't actually threaten you, you might adopt her way of speaking to yourself, her standards of cleanliness or success, her fears about money or relationships, her way of handling conflict or expressing emotions. This identification can be so complete that you don't even recognize it's happening. You might think these thoughts and feelings are simply part of your personality, never realizing that they are actually inherited patterns that don't necessarily reflect your authentic self. Jung called this living someone else's life, going through the motions of your own existence while actually following a script written by someone else's unconscious. The internal mother also manifests in your relationships with others. You might find yourself attracted to people who trigger the same dynamics you experienced with your mother. Perhaps their criticism reminds you of her disapproval, or their emotional needs activate your caretaking patterns. You might also find yourself projecting the internal mother onto authority figures, romantic partners, or even friends, expecting them to provide the nurturing, validation, or structure that you never learned to give yourself. For many people, the internal mother becomes the primary lens through which they view themselves. Instead of developing their own sense of worth based on their authentic qualities and experiences, they continue to see themselves through her eyes, seeking her approval, fearing her criticism, measuring themselves against her standards. This keeps them trapped in a perpetual childhood, always seeking to please a parent who may no longer even be alive. The internal mother also influences your relationship with your own creativity and life force. If she was threatened by your aliveness, your curiosity, your joy, or your independence, you might have learned to dim these qualities to avoid threatening her. As an adult, you might find yourself sabotaging your own success, suppressing your creativity, or feeling guilty when you're happy, all in unconscious loyalty to the internal mother's need to maintain control. Jung emphasized that recognizing the internal mother is often the most challenging part of healing the mother complex, because it requires distinguishing between what is authentically yours and what you've inherited. It means listening to your thoughts and asking, whose voice is this really? It means examining your emotional reactions and wondering, am I responding to this situation, or am I responding to an old pattern? The process of separating from the internal mother is not about rejecting everything you learned from your actual mother. Much of it may be valuable and worth keeping. It's about developing the discernment to choose consciously which patterns serve your authentic self and which ones keep you trapped in old dynamics. It's about learning to think your own thoughts, feel your own feelings, and make your own choices, even when they differ from what the internal mother would approve of. This separation often feels like psychological death, because the internal mother has been such a central organizing principle in your psyche. But Jung understood that this death is actually a rebirth, the emergence of your authentic self from beneath the layers of inherited patterns and unconscious loyalties. Chapter 4. The Invisible Chains. Unconscious Loyalty and Self-Betrayal. One of Jung's most profound insights about the mother complex was his recognition of what he called unconscious loyalty, a psychological phenomenon where we remain bound to our mother's patterns, limitations, and emotional world. Not out of conscious love, but out of an unconscious fear that growing beyond her would constitute abandonment or betrayal. This loyalty operates beneath the threshold of awareness, which makes it particularly insidious. You might consciously want to be different from your mother, to avoid her mistakes, to live a fuller life than she did. But unconsciously, there might be a part of you that believes that surpassing her, healing what she couldn't heal, or achieving what she couldn't achieve would be a form of cruelty toward her. Jung observed that children often make unconscious vows to their parents, promises that they don't remember making but that continue to govern their lives decades later. These might include vows like, I will never be happier than you. I will carry your pain so you don't have to feel alone. I will sacrifice my dreams to prove that I love you. Or I will never become fully independent because you need me. These unconscious loyalties explain why so many people self-sabotage just as they're about to achieve something significant. The internal alarm system, programmed by the mother complex, begins to signal danger. If I succeed where she failed, I'm abandoning her. If I heal what she couldn't heal, I'm making her look bad. If I'm truly happy when she was miserable, I'm being cruel. The unconscious loyalty also manifests in what Jung called inherited guilt, a sense of responsibility for the mother's emotional well-being that begins in childhood and continues into adulthood. Many people spend their entire lives trying to fix, save, or heal their mothers, either literally or symbolically, never recognizing that this is an impossible task that keeps them trapped in a. This inherited guilt often shows up as a fear of disappointing others, an inability to set boundaries, a tendency to overgive in relationships, or a compulsion to take care of everyone else's emotional needs while neglecting your own. You might find yourself saying yes when you want to say no, apologizing for things that aren't your fault, or feeling responsible for other people's feelings and reactions. The unconscious loyalty can also manifest as what Jung called identification with the victim, a pattern where you unconsciously take on your mother's role as the one who suffers, who sacrifices, who doesn't get her needs met. This identification might feel like love or compassion, but it's actually a form of psychological fusion that prevents both healing and growth. For some people, the unconscious loyalty appears as an inability to surpass the mother in any significant way. They might unconsciously limit their success, their happiness, their relationships, or their creative expression to avoid threatening the mother's position or making her feel inadequate. They live smaller lives, not because they lack ability or opportunity, but because growing larger would feel like betrayal. Jung also recognized that unconscious loyalty could manifest as repetition, unconsciously recreating the mother's patterns, even when you consciously want to do something different. You might find yourself making the same relationship choices she made, developing the same fears or limitations, or even adopting her physical symptoms or health problems. This repetition is not conscious mimicry but an unconscious attempt to maintain connection and avoid the terror of psychological separation. The unconscious loyalty is often reinforced by the mother herself, even when she consciously wants her children to be happy and successful. She might send mixed messages, verbally encouraging independence while emotionally punishing it, or supporting your success while subtly communicating that it threatens her. These mixed messages create what psychologists call double binds. Situations where you can't win, no matter what choice you make. Breaking free from unconscious loyalty requires recognizing that true love does not require sacrifice of the self. In fact, Jung argued that the greatest gift we can give our parents is to live fully authentic lives, even if that means growing beyond their limitations or healing what they couldn't heal. This is not abandonment, it's evolution. The process of breaking unconscious loyalty often involves what Jung called conscious betrayal, the deliberate choice to live according to your own values and vision rather than the inherited patterns. This feels like betrayal because it disrupts the familiar dynamics and challenges the mother's unconscious need to maintain control. But it's actually the most loving thing you can do because it frees both you and your mother from the unconscious entanglement that benefits no one. Jung understood that this process of separation is essential for psychological health, but it's also one of the most terrifying things a person can do. The child within fears that separation equals death, that growing beyond the mother means losing all connection to love and life itself. This fear is primitive and powerful, which is why so many people never attempt this separation, choosing instead to remain in the familiar prison of unconscious loyalty. But Jung also recognized that on the other side of this terror lies something precious. The discovery of your authentic self, freed from the need to carry anyone else's burdens or live anyone else's life. This authentic self is capable of loving freely, creating freely, and living according to its own inner truth, rather than inherited programming. The breaking of unconscious loyalty is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process of choosing consciousness over comfort, authenticity over approval, growth over familiar stagnation. Each time you make a choice that honors your true self rather than your internalized mother, you strengthen your capacity for genuine independence and authentic love. Chapter 5. The Patterns We Repeat. How the Mother Complex Manifests in Adult Life. The mother complex doesn't stay contained in your relationship with your actual mother. It spreads like invisible ink throughout every area of your adult life, shaping your relationships, your career choices, your self-talk, and even your physical health in ways that you might never consciously recognize. In romantic relationships, the mother complex often manifests as what Jung called transference, unconsciously treating your partner as if they were your mother and expecting them to fulfill the same role she played in your life. This might mean seeking a partner who will take care of you the way she did, or the way you wished she had, or choosing someone who triggers the same emotional dynamics that felt familiar from childhood. If your mother was emotionally unavailable, you might find yourself attracted to partners who are also emotionally distant, unconsciously hoping that this time you'll be able to win the love that always felt just out of reach. If your mother was controlling, you might choose partners who try to control you, or you might become the controlling one, unconsciously identifying with her role. If your mother was critical, you might seek partners who criticize you, or you might become hypercritical of them. These patterns often feel like destiny or chemistry, but Jung understood them as unconscious repetitions of unfinished childhood business. The psyche keeps trying to solve the original wound by recreating the original situation, but since the partner is not actually your mother, and you are not actually a child, these attempts at resolution inevitably fail. The mother complex also shapes your relationship with authority figures, your boss, your doctor, your therapist, your teacher. All of these relationships can become contaminated with mother projections. You might find yourself seeking their approval the way you once sought your mother's, or rebelling against their guidance the way you learned to protect yourself from her control. You might become overly dependent on their validation, or you might reject their input even when it would be helpful. In your career, the mother complex might manifest as difficulty with success, creativity, or leadership. If your mother felt threatened by your achievements or your independence, you might unconsciously sabotage yourself whenever you start to succeed. If she needed you to take care of her, you might find yourself in helping professions, where you can continue to play the caretaker role. If she was disappointed in her own career, you might feel guilty about surpassing her. The mother complex also influences your relationship with money, which often carries deep emotional associations with security, worth, and love. If your mother used money as a form of control, you might struggle with financial boundaries or feel guilty about spending money on yourself. If she was anxious about money, you might inherit her scarcity mindset even if your actual financial situation is secure. If she equated money with love, you might find yourself either pursuing wealth compulsively or rejecting it unconsciously. Perhaps most significantly, the mother complex shapes your inner dialogue, the way you speak to yourself in your private moments. Jung recognized that this internal voice is often not your authentic voice, but the internalized voice of your mother, complete with her judgments, her fears, her expectations, and her way of seeing the world. This internalized mother might show up as the perfectionist who is never satisfied with your efforts, the critic who points out everything that's wrong, the warrior who imagines disasters that rarely happen, or the guilt inducer who makes you feel bad for having needs or setting boundaries. She might also appear as the voice that minimizes your achievements, dismisses your feelings, or tells you that you're asking for too much from life. The mother complex also manifests in your relationship with other women. If your relationship with your mother was competitive or hostile, you might find yourself unconsciously competing with other women or feeling threatened by their success. If your mother taught you that women are not trustworthy, you might have difficulty forming close friendships with women. If she modeled self-sacrifice and people-pleasing, you might expect other women to prioritize your needs over their own. Physical symptoms can also be manifestations of the mother complex. Jung recognized that unexpressed emotions and unconscious conflicts often appear in the body as illness, pain, or dysfunction. If you learn to suppress your emotions to avoid threatening your mother, you might develop physical symptoms that force you to slow down or seek care. If you inherited her anxiety, you might experience panic attacks, digestive issues, or sleep problems. If you took on her depression, you might struggle with chronic fatigue or immune system problems. The mother complex also influences your relationship with spirituality and meaning. If your mother was religiously rigid, you might rebel against all forms of spirituality, or you might become equally rigid in your spiritual practice. If she was spiritually hungry but never found satisfaction, you might inherit her searching without ever feeling like you found what you're looking for. If she used spirituality as a form of escape or superiority, you might be suspicious of spiritual pursuits altogether. Jung observed that these patterns persist because they operate below the level of conscious awareness. You might recognize that you have relationship problems, career difficulties, or health issues, but you might not see the connection to your early mother relationship. The patterns feel like personality traits, genetic predispositions, or unfortunate circumstances rather than unconscious repetitions of childhood dynamics. The key to breaking these patterns is what Jung called making the unconscious conscious, developing the ability to see the connections between your current difficulties and your early emotional programming. This requires honest self-examination, often with the help of therapy, journaling, or other forms of inner work that can help you recognize when you're responding to current situations with old emotional patterns. Once you begin to see these patterns clearly, you gain the power to choose differently. Instead of automatically repeating the familiar dynamics, you can pause, recognize what's happening, and make a conscious choice based on your adult understanding rather than your childhood programming. Chapter 6. The body remembers. Physical manifestations of the mother complex. Jung was one of the first psychologists to recognize that psychological wounds don't just live in the mind. They embed themselves in the body, creating physical symptoms that persist long after the original emotional trauma has been forgotten. The mother complex, being one of the most fundamental psychological patterns, often manifests in physical symptoms that seem unrelated to childhood experiences but are actually the body's way of expressing what the mind has been unable to process. The mother complex often begins forming before explicit memory comes online, which means it gets encoded in what scientists now call implicit memory, the body's remembering of emotional states, nervous system patterns, and relational dynamics. This is why you might have physical reactions to certain types of people, situations, or environments that feel completely irrational, but are actually your body's way of recognizing familiar patterns. If your early relationship with your mother was characterized by anxiety, your nervous system learned to live in a state of hypervigilance. Even decades later, you might experience chronic anxiety, panic attacks, or a general sense of unease that doesn't seem connected to your current life circumstances. Your body is still scanning for the dangers it learned to watch for in childhood, even when those dangers no longer exist. If your mother was emotionally unpredictable, sometimes loving, sometimes withdrawn, sometimes angry, your nervous system never learned to relax into a sense of basic safety. This might manifest as difficulty sleeping, digestive issues, or autoimmune problems. Your body remains in a state of chronic stress because it never learned that the world could be predictable and safe. If you learn to suppress your emotions to avoid threatening your mother or to maintain her approval, those suppressed emotions often get stored in the body as physical tension, pain, or illness. Unexpressed anger might manifest as jaw tension, headaches, or back pain. Unprocessed grief might show up as chest tightness, breathing difficulties, or heart problems. Suppressed fear might create stomach problems, immune system dysfunction, or chronic fatigue. Jung observed that many people who struggle with eating disorders have complex relationships with the mother archetype. Food is our first experience of nurturing, and feeding is one of the primary ways mothers bond with their children. If this early feeding relationship was problematic, perhaps the mother was anxious about eating, used food as control, or was inconsistent in providing nourishment. The mother complex can also manifest as what Jung called psychosomatic identification, unconsciously taking on your mother's physical symptoms or health problems. If your mother suffered from depression, you might develop similar symptoms, even if your life circumstances are very different from hers. If she had chronic pain, you might develop unexplained pain in the same areas of your body. If she was prone to certain illnesses, you might unconsciously fear or expect to develop the same conditions. This identification often serves an unconscious psychological function. It maintains connection with the mother through shared suffering, or it expresses unconscious guilt about having a healthier or happier life than she did. The body becomes a way of maintaining loyalty to the mother's experience, even when this loyalty is self-destructive. Jung also recognized that the mother complex often manifests in the throat and voice. If you learned that your voice was not welcome, that speaking your truth, expressing your needs, or showing your emotions threatened your mother, you might develop chronic throat problems, voice issues, or difficulty speaking up in important situations. The body literally constricts the voice to maintain the familiar pattern of silence. Breathing problems are another common manifestation of the mother complex. If your mother was anxious or depressed, you might have learned to breathe shallowly to avoid feeling too much or taking up too much space. If the emotional atmosphere of your home was heavy or oppressive, you might have learned to restrict your breathing as a way of making yourself smaller and less threatening. These breathing patterns often persist into adulthood, creating anxiety, panic attacks, or a general sense of not being able to get enough air. The mother complex can also affect your relationship with your own reproductive system. If your mother had difficulty with her own sexuality, fertility, or relationship with her feminine body, you might unconsciously inherit these difficulties. If she was afraid of your developing sexuality, you might develop problems with sexual function or reproductive health. If she was competitive with your femininity, you might struggle with menstrual problems, fertility issues, or difficulty embracing your own feminine nature. Jung understood that healing the mother complex often requires not just psychological work but also body-based healing practices that help release the physical patterns that were formed in childhood. This might include massage, yoga, breathwork, dance, or other forms of somatic therapy that help the body remember its natural patterns of ease and vitality. The body also holds the positive aspects of the mother relationship, and healing work can help you reconnect with these resources. If you experienced moments of genuine nurturing, safety, or love with your mother, these experiences are also stored in your body as patterns of ease, trust, and vitality that can be accessed and strengthened through conscious practice. One of the most important aspects of healing the physical manifestations of the mother complex is learning to trust your body's wisdom. If you learned to override your body's signals to accommodate your mother's needs or emotional state, you might have lost touch with your body's natural intelligence. Healing involves learning to listen to your body's signals about hunger, fatigue, pleasure, pain, and emotional states, and honoring these signals rather than ignoring them. Jung believed that the body is not just the container for psychological wounds, it's also the vehicle for healing. By developing a conscious, loving relationship with your body, you can begin to release the physical patterns that have been keeping you trapped in old emotional dynamics, and discover the body's natural capacity for health, vitality, and pleasure. Chapter 7. The Path of Individuation. Separating from the mother complex. Jung's concept of individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole and authentic, requires what he considered one of the most challenging tasks of human development: separating from the mother complex without destroying the positive aspects of the mother relationship. This separation is not about cutting off contact with your actual mother or rejecting everything you learned from her. It's about developing the psychological independence to think your own thoughts, feel your own feelings, and make your own choices, even when they differ from what the internalized mother would approve of. The process of individuation typically begins with what Jung called the recognition of the complex. Becoming aware of how the mother pattern operates in your life. This recognition often comes through repeated relationship difficulties, career frustrations, or emotional patterns that don't seem to respond to conscious effort to change them. You might notice that you keep attracting the same type of partner, repeating the same self-defeating behaviors, or feeling stuck in ways that don't make logical sense. The first stage of separation involves what Jung called disidentification, learning to distinguish between what is authentically yours and what you inherited from your mother. This requires developing what he called the observing ego, a part of yourself that can step back and watch your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors with curiosity rather than judgment. You begin to ask questions like, whose voice is this really? Am I reacting to this situation or to an old pattern? What would I choose if I weren't afraid of disappointing her? This disidentification process often involves grief because it requires giving up the fantasy of the perfect mother or the perfect childhood. Even if your childhood was difficult, there's often a part of you that still hopes that somehow your mother will change, will finally give you what you needed, will validate your worth in the way you always longed for. Individuation requires accepting that this may never happen and that your healing doesn't depend on her changing. The second stage involves what Jung called active imagination, consciously engaging with the mother complex, as if it were a separate entity within your psyche. This might involve writing letters to your internalized mother, having imaginary conversations with her, or even dialoguing with the different aspects of the mother archetype through journaling or meditation. The goal is not to eliminate these internal voices, but to develop a conscious relationship with them, understanding their concerns, while maintaining your own authority. During this stage, you might experience what Jung called the dark night of the soul, a period of disorientation, depression, or anxiety, as the old patterns begin to dissolve, but new ones haven't yet formed. This is a natural part of the individuation process, but it can feel terrifying, because the ego is losing its familiar reference points. You might feel like you don't know who you are anymore, like you're losing your connection to love, or like you're betraying something sacred by growing beyond your mother's limitations. Jung emphasized that this dark night is actually a sign that the work is progressing. The dissolution of the old patterns creates space for something new to emerge, but it requires faith and patience because the new self doesn't appear all at once. It emerges gradually through countless small choices to honor your authentic feelings, thoughts, and desires, rather than the inherited pattern. The third stage involves what Jung called the emergence of the authentic self, the gradual development of your own values, preferences, and way of being in the world. This authentic self is not in opposition to your mother but is independent of her approval or disapproval. It can appreciate what she gave you while also recognizing what she couldn't provide. It can love her without needing to carry her burdens or repeat her patterns. This emergence often involves reclaiming parts of yourself that were suppressed or rejected in childhood. If you learned to hide your emotions, you might need to rediscover your capacity to feel deeply. If you learn to minimize your needs, you might need to practice asking for what you want. If you learn to dim your light to avoid threatening others, you might need to allow yourself to shine fully. The process of individuation also involves what Jung called reparenting yourself, learning to provide for yourself the nurturing, guidance, and protection that you needed, but didn't receive. This is not about becoming your own parent in a literal sense, but about developing the internal capacity to care for yourself with the same attention and compassion you would give to a beloved child. Reparenting involves learning to listen to your own needs and feelings, to comfort yourself when you're distressed, to celebrate your successes, to set appropriate boundaries, and to make decisions based on your own values rather than inherited programming. It means developing an internal voice that is kind, supportive, and encouraging, rather than critical, demanding, or fearful. Jung understood that this reparenting process often activates intense resistance from the mother complex because it threatens the familiar patterns of dependency and control. You might experience guilt for taking care of yourself, fear about making your own decisions, or anxiety about losing connection to love. These reactions are normal and expected. They're signs that you're touching the core of the complex. The fourth stage involves what Jung called conscious relationship. Developing the ability to relate to your actual mother if she's still alive, as an adult rather than as a child. This means seeing her as a complete human being with her own struggles, limitations, and unconscious patterns, rather than as the all-powerful figure she seemed to be when you were young. This conscious relationship doesn't necessarily mean having a close or easy relationship with your mother. It means being able to interact with her without losing yourself, without automatically reverting to childhood patterns, and without needing her to be different than she is. You can appreciate her humanity while also protecting yourself from her limitations. For some people, this conscious relationship involves setting clear boundaries about what kinds of interactions feel healthy and sustainable. For others, it might mean having limited or no contact if the relationship is too damaging to their well-being. Jung emphasized that there's no universal right way to relate to your mother. The goal is to make conscious choices based on your adult understanding rather than unconscious programming. The final stage of individuation involves what Jung called integration, bringing together all the different aspects of yourself into a coherent whole. This includes integrating the positive aspects of your mother's influence, the wisdom gained from healing your wounds, and the authentic self that has emerged through the process. Integration means no longer seeing the mother complex as an enemy to be defeated, but as a teacher that helped you develop important capacities like empathy, resilience, and depth. It means understanding that your mother's limitations, while painful, also contributed to your strength and wisdom. It means appreciating that the very wounds that caused you suffering also cracked you open to greater love and consciousness. Jung believed that successful individuation creates what he called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox and complexity without needing to resolve everything into simple categories of good and bad. You can love your mother while also recognizing her shadow. You can appreciate your childhood while also acknowledging its wounds. You can be grateful for your experiences while also choosing to live differently. This integration is not a final destination but an ongoing process. The mother complex may continue to arise in new situations or relationships, but you now have the tools to recognize it and make conscious choices about how to respond. You've developed what Jung called the mature ego, a sense of self that is both rooted in your authentic nature and flexible enough to continue growing and learning throughout your life. Chapter 8. The Inner Marriage, Reclaiming the Feminine Within. One of the most profound aspects of healing the mother complex is what Jung called the reclamation of the inner feminine, the restoration of your relationship with the receptive, intuitive, creative, and emotionally intelligent aspects of your psyche that may have been damaged or suppressed in your early relationship with your mother. Jung understood that every human being, regardless of gender, contains both masculine and feminine psychological principles. The masculine principle is associated with action, logic, structure, and goal-oriented thinking. The feminine principle is associated with receptivity, intuition, creativity, emotional depth, and the ability to be present with what is rather than always trying to change or fix things. In a healthy childhood, the mother serves as the child's first introduction to the feminine principle. Through her nurturing, her emotional attunement, her ability to create safety and beauty, and her modeling of how to be in relationship, she helps the child develop their own capacity for these qualities. But when the mother relationship is wounded or distorted, it can damage the child's connection to their inner feminine, creating long-leaning problems with creativity, intuition, emotional expression, and the ability to receive love and nurturing. For men, this damage often manifests as fear or distrust of feminine energy, both in themselves and in others. They might become overly identified with masculine qualities like control, logic, and achievement, while suppressing their capacity for emotional depth, creativity, and receptivity. This creates what Jung called the divided masculine, men who are successful in the outer world but feel empty or disconnected in their inner world and intimate relationships. For women, the damage might manifest as competition with other women, difficulty accessing their own power and creativity, or the tendency to suppress their feminine qualities in order to succeed in a masculine culture. They might become disconnected from their intuition, their sexuality, their creative expression, or their ability to receive support and nurturing from others. Jung believed that healing the mother complex requires what he called the inner marriage, the conscious integration of masculine and feminine principles within the individual psyche. This is not about becoming androgynous or eliminating gender differences, but about developing access to the full spectrum of human capacities regardless of your biological sex. The process of reclaiming the inner feminine often begins with recognizing how it was damaged or suppressed in your childhood. Perhaps your emotional expressions were seen as too much or inappropriate. Perhaps your creativity was discouraged or ignored. Perhaps your intuitive insights were dismissed in favor of logical analysis. Perhaps your need for nurturing was met with discomfort or criticism. These early experiences often create what Jung called the wounded feminine, a part of the psyche that has learned to hide, to protect itself, to distrust others, or to only express itself in distorted ways. The wounded feminine might manifest as emotional numbness, creative blocks, difficulty receiving love or compliments, problems with sexuality or sensuality, or the tendency to caretake others while neglecting your own needs. Healing the wounded feminine requires what Jung called active imagination, consciously dialoguing with this part of yourself as if it were a separate person. You might imagine her as a young girl who has been hiding, waiting for someone to see her and validate her worth. You might visualize her as a creative force that has been suppressed but is still alive and ready to emerge. You might experience her as a wise woman who has been silenced but has important insights to share. This dialogue process helps you understand what the wounded feminine needs in order to heal and emerge. She might need permission to feel deeply, to express creativity, to ask for what she wants. to say no when something doesn't feel right, to trust her intuition, or to receive nurturing without feeling guilty. As you begin to provide these things for yourself, the wounded feminine begins to transform into what Jung called the integrated feminine, a source of wisdom, creativity, and life force within your psyche. The integrated feminine is not the same as the mother archetype, though it includes some of the same qualities. The integrated feminine is your own connection to receptive, creative, and intuitive energy rather than a projection onto an external figure. She can nurture without smothering, create without needing approval, feel deeply without being overwhelmed, and trust without being naive. For men, integrating the feminine often involves learning to access their emotions, to be vulnerable in intimate relationships, to appreciate beauty and creativity, to trust their intuition, and to receive care and support from others. This doesn't make them less masculine. It makes them more complete human beings who can bring depth and authenticity to their relationships and creative expression. For women, integrating the feminine often involves reclaiming their power, their voice, their creativity, and their right to take up space in the world. It means learning to honor their emotional intelligence, to trust their intuition, to express their sexuality and sensuality without shame, and to create and lead in ways that honor both their strength and their receptivity. Jung emphasized that this integration of the feminine is not just a personal healing process, it's also a cultural necessity. He believed that Western civilization had become dangerously unbalanced in favor of masculine values like competition, control, and rational analysis, while suppressing feminine values like collaboration, intuition, and emotional intelligence. He saw the healing of the mother complex as part of a larger cultural shift toward a more balanced and sustainable way of being in the world. The reclaimed feminine also brings with it what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox and complexity without needing to resolve everything into simple categories. The feminine principle can hold both joy and sorrow, strength and vulnerability, independence and connection. This capacity for paradox is essential for psychological maturity and for navigating the complexities of adult life and relationships. As you reclaim your inner feminine, you might notice changes in your creativity, your relationships, your decision-making process, and your overall sense of vitality and aliveness. You might find yourself more drawn to beauty, more sensitive to your environment, more able to trust your gut feelings, more comfortable with emotional expression, and more capable of creating intimate, authentic relationships. This reclamation is not a return to childhood or a regression to an earlier state of development. It's an integration that includes both your wounded history and your mature understanding, both your masculine capacities and your feminine wisdom. Jung called this the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites that creates wholeness within the individual psyche. Chapter 9. Breaking the generational patterns. Becoming a conscious ancestor. One of the most profound gifts of healing your mother complex is the opportunity to become what Jung called a conscious ancestor. Someone who breaks the unconscious patterns that have been passed down through generations and creates new possibilities for future generations. This is not just about healing yourself, it's about transforming the family system and contributing to the evolution of human consciousness. Jung understood that psychological patterns are inherited not just through genetics, but through what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological patterns that are passed down through families, cultures, and the human species as a whole. These patterns can be sources of wisdom and strength, but they can also be sources of limitation and suffering when they're transmitted unconsciously. Every family system has what Jung called unlived lives, dreams that were never pursued, emotions that were never expressed, traumas that were never healed, and potentials that were never realized. These unlived lives don't disappear, they get passed down to subsequent generations as psychological pressures, unconscious expectations, and inherited burden. The mother complex is often a vehicle for transmitting these unlived lives. A mother who was never allowed to pursue her creative dreams might unconsciously pressure her child to become an artist, or she might discourage their creativity out of her own unhealed wounds. A mother who was never allowed to express her anger might raise a child who either becomes explosively angry or who completely suppresses their own anger. A mother who was never financially secure might create a child who becomes obsessed with money or who refuses to engage with financial reality altogether. Jung observed that these inherited patterns often intensify as they're passed down through generations. The original trauma or limitation becomes more and more concentrated until it finally becomes so intense that someone in the family system is forced to deal with it consciously. This person becomes what Jung called the designated healer, the one who carries the family's wounds most intensely, but who also has the greatest opportunity to transform them. If you're reading this, you're likely that designated healer in your family system. You're the one who can't ignore the patterns anymore, who feels the pain most acutely, who's been forced to seek help and understanding. This might feel like a burden, but Jung understood it as a sacred calling, an opportunity to transform not just your own life, but the trajectory of your entire family line. Breaking generational patterns requires what Jung called conscious suffering, the willingness to feel the pain that previous generations avoided or suppressed, rather than passing it on unconsciously. This means staying present with difficult emotions instead of numbing them, examining your patterns instead of repeating them automatically, and making different choices even when they feel uncomfortable or unfamiliar. This conscious suffering is not masochistic or self-punishing. It's the kind of suffering that leads to transformation. The pain of growth, the discomfort of change, the grief of letting go of familiar patterns that no longer serve. Jung distinguished this from unconscious suffering, the kind of repetitive pain that doesn't lead anywhere, that just recreates the same patterns over and over again. One of the most important aspects of becoming a conscious ancestor is learning to hold space for the complexity of your mother's experience without taking on her burdens as your own. This means understanding that she too was shaped by generational patterns, that she too carried unlived lives and inherited wounds, that she too was doing her best with the resources she had available. This understanding doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does provide a context that can help you respond to your mother with compassion rather than just reaction. When you can see her as a link in a chain of unconscious transmission rather than as the ultimate source of all problems, you can begin to work with the pattern rather than just fighting against it. Breaking generational patterns also involves what Jung called conscious parenting, even if you never have children of your own. This means developing the capacity to nurture, guide, and protect the childlike parts of yourself and others without repeating the unconscious mistakes of previous generations. It means learning to provide the kind of love that doesn't control, the kind of support that doesn't create dependency, and the kind of guidance that encourages authentic development rather than conformity to external expectations. If you do have children, conscious parenting means being aware of your own unconscious patterns and working to heal them rather than automatically passing them on. It means recognizing when you're responding to your children from your own wounded child rather than from your adult wisdom. It means creating space for their authentic selves to emerge rather than trying to mold them into your own image or your unfulfilled dreams. Jung believed that conscious parenting extends beyond biological children to include mentoring, teaching, creating, and contributing to the world in ways that nurture future generations. Every act of consciousness, every choice to respond differently than your programming would dictate, every moment of healing your own wounds contributes to the healing of the collective human psyche. The process of becoming a conscious ancestor often involves what Jung called active imagination with your family lineage. Consciously connecting with the wisdom and strength of your ancestors while also acknowledging and transforming their limitations. This might involve researching your family history, honoring the positive qualities that have been passed down, and consciously choosing which patterns to continue and which to transform. Some people find it helpful to create rituals that acknowledge their role as pattern breakers, ceremonies that honor their ancestors while also declaring their intention to live differently. These rituals help the unconscious understand that you're not rejecting your family but evolving it, not abandoning your heritage but transforming it. Jung also emphasized the importance of what he called cultural healing, recognizing that individual healing contributes to the healing of larger cultural patterns. The mother complex is not just a personal issue, it's also a reflection of how our culture treats women, children, emotions, and the feminine principle in general. By healing your own mother complex, you contribute to a cultural shift toward healthier ways of nurturing, relating, and raising children. Becoming a conscious ancestor is ultimately about taking responsibility for your own healing, and growth not just for your own benefit, but for the benefit of all beings. It's about understanding that your individual consciousness is connected to the collective consciousness, that your healing contributes to the healing of the world, and that your choice to live consciously creates new possibilities for everyone who comes after you. This is perhaps the deepest gift of doing this difficult inner work, the knowledge that you're not just changing your own life but participating in the evolution of human consciousness itself. You're becoming an ancestor that future generations will be grateful for, someone who had the courage to face the darkness and transform it into light. Chapter 10. The Sacred Wound. Finding Meaning in Your Mother Complex. As we near the end of our exploration, it's important to understand that Jung didn't view the mother complex as merely a problem to be solved or a wound to be healed. He saw it as what he called a sacred wound, a source of both suffering and wisdom, a catalyst for growth, and ultimately a gateway to deeper understanding of yourself and the human condition. Jung observed that our greatest wounds often become our greatest gifts, that the places where we've been most broken are often where we develop the greatest capacity for healing others, and that the patterns that have caused us the most pain often contain the seeds of our most profound wisdom and creativity. The mother complex, because it touches the very foundation of how we learn to love and be loved, can become a source of extraordinary depth, empathy, and insight. People who have struggled with mother issues often develop unusual sensitivity to emotional dynamics, keen intuition about relationships, and a profound understanding of the human need for nurturing and connection. Many of the world's greatest healers, teachers, artists, and spiritual leaders have transformed their own mother wounds into sources of service and wisdom. They've learned to provide for others the kind of unconditional love, deep seeing, and emotional safety that they themselves longed for but didn't receive in their early years. This transformation doesn't happen automatically. It requires what Jung called conscious suffering and the transmutation of pain into wisdom. It means allowing your wounds to break your heart open rather than closed, to increase your compassion rather than your bitterness, to deepen your understanding rather than your resentment. Jung believed that this process of transformation is what gives meaning to suffering. Without the possibility of transformation, pain is just pain, random, meaningless, purely destructive. But when pain becomes a catalyst for growth, consciousness, and service, it takes on what he called a sacred dimension. It becomes part of a larger story of healing and evolution. The sacred dimension of the mother complex is often connected to what Jung called the wounded healer architect. The recognition that those who have been wounded in a particular way often develop the greatest capacity to heal others who have similar wounds. This doesn't mean that all wounded people automatically become healers, but it does mean that conscious engagement with your wounds can transform them into sources of wisdom and service. Many people discover that their mother complex has given them gifts that they wouldn't trade, even if they could eliminate the pain it caused. Perhaps it gave them unusual empathy for others who are struggling. Perhaps it forced them to develop independence and resilience. Perhaps it opened them to spiritual seeking or creative expression. Perhaps it taught them to value authentic connection over superficial relationships. Jung also recognized that the mother complex often contains what he called unrealized potentials, capacities and qualities that were suppressed in childhood but that can be reclaimed and developed in adulthood. If your creativity was discouraged, healing the mother complex might unleash extraordinary artistic abilities. If your emotional expression was suppressed, healing might give you access to profound emotional intelligence. If your independence was discouraged, healing might reveal natural leadership abilities. These unrealized potentials don't just benefit you, they become gifts that you can offer to the world. Your unique combination of wounds and healing, struggles and insights, patterns and transformations creates a particular kind of wisdom that only you can provide. Jung called this your unique contribution to the collective unconscious, the specific way that your individual healing contributes to the healing of humanity as a whole. The process of finding meaning in your mother complex often involves what Jung called the rewriting of your personal mythology, transforming the story you tell about your childhood from a tale of victimization to a story of initiation, from a narrative of damage to a chronicle of transformation. This doesn't mean denying the reality of what happened or minimizing the pain you experienced. It means finding a larger context that gives meaning to your suffering and hope for your future. It means understanding that your struggles have been preparing you for something important, that your wounds have been carving out space for greater love and wisdom, that your challenges have been developing capacities that you'll need for your life's work. Jung believed that everyone has what he called a personal myth, an underlying story that gives meaning and direction to their life. For many people, this myth remains unconscious, and they live their lives without understanding their deeper purpose or direction. But those who consciously engage with their wounds and patterns often discover their personal myth and begin living in alignment with it. Your personal myth might involve becoming a healer, teacher, artist, or leader who helps others navigate similar challenges. It might involve breaking generational patterns and creating new possibilities for your family line. It might involve contributing to cultural healing around issues of nurturing, parenting, or feminine wisdom. It might involve developing new forms of community, relationship, or spiritual practice. The key is recognizing that your mother complex, far from being just a personal problem, is actually preparation for your life's work. The very patterns that have caused you the most difficulty are also the ones that will give you the greatest authority and authenticity when you step into your role as a healer, teacher, or guide for others. Jung also emphasized that finding meaning in your mother complex doesn't require forgiveness of your mother or gratitude for your pain. It requires what he called integration, the ability to hold both the difficulty and the gift, both the wound and the wisdom, both the limitation and the potential. You can acknowledge that your childhood was painful while also recognizing that it prepared you for important work. You can honor your struggles while also celebrating your growth. This integration often brings with it what Jung called a sense of destiny. The feeling that your life has been unfolding according to a deeper pattern, that your challenges have been meaningful, and that your healing serves a purpose larger than just your personal happiness. This doesn't mean that everything that happened was meant to be, but it does mean that you can find ways to use everything that happened for purposes of growth, healing, and service. Ultimately, Jung believed that the goal of working with the mother complex is not to eliminate it, but to transform it from an unconscious source of suffering into a conscious source of wisdom and compassion. The complex doesn't disappear. It becomes integrated into your personality as a source of depth, empathy, and understanding, rather than a source of compulsion and reactivity. This transformation is what Jung called the redemption of the wound, the process by which our greatest sources of pain become our greatest sources of power, wisdom, and service. It's the alchemical process by which lead is transformed into gold, by which suffering becomes compassion, by which wounds become doorways to healing. Conclusion: the return to wholeness. As we reach the end of this journey into the depths of the mother complex, it's important to understand that this is not really an ending but a beginning. The work of healing and integration is not something you complete once and then move on from. It's an ongoing process of consciousness, choice, and growth that continues throughout your life. Jung understood that the path of individuation, becoming who you truly are beneath all the inherited patterns and unconscious programming, is the central task of human life. It's what gives meaning to our existence, purpose to our struggles, and direction to our growth. The mother complex, rather than being an obstacle to this individuation, can become one of its most powerful catalysts when approached with consciousness and courage. The journey we've taken together through these pages mirrors the archetypal journey that Jung called the hero's journey, the mythic pattern of leaving the familiar world, facing challenges and shadows, gaining wisdom and power, and returning transformed to serve others. In psychological terms, this means leaving the unconscious patterns of childhood, facing the complex dynamics that have been governing your life, gaining insight and healing, and returning to the world with new capacities for authenticity, love, and service. But this return is not a simple homecoming. You don't go back to being who you were before you began this work. Instead, you become what Jung called the individuated person, someone who has integrated their shadows, reclaimed their projections, healed their wounds, and developed the capacity to live from their authentic self, rather than from inherited programming. The individuated person who has worked with their mother complex carries certain distinctive qualities. They have the capacity for genuine intimacy without losing themselves or trying to control others. They can give and receive love freely without the distortions of neediness, guilt, or manipulation. They can set boundaries without hostility and maintain connection without enmeshment. They can honor their parents and their heritage while also living according to their own values and vision. Perhaps most importantly, they develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox and complexity without needing to resolve everything into simple categories of good and bad. They can love their mother while also acknowledging her limitations. They can be grateful for their childhood while also recognizing its wounds. They can appreciate the gifts their struggles have given them while also wishing things had been different. This capacity for paradox is essential for psychological maturity because life itself is paradoxical. Love and pain often come together. Growth requires both stability and change. Healing involves both accepting what was and creating what could be. The mother complex teaches us to navigate these paradoxes with wisdom rather than being torn apart by them. The work of healing the mother complex also contributes to what Jung called the healing of the collective unconscious, the gradual evolution of human consciousness toward greater awareness, compassion, and wisdom. Every person who does this inner work consciously contributes to making it easier for future generations to grow up with healthier relationships to nurturing, parenting, and the feminine principle. In our current cultural moment, this work feels particularly urgent. We live in a time when many of the old patterns around gender, family, relationships, and child-rearing are being questioned and transformed. The work of healing the mother complex is part of this larger cultural healing, part of creating new possibilities for how we raise children, how we relate to each other, and how we balance the masculine and feminine principles in our individual and collective lives. But perhaps the most important outcome of this work is the development of what Jung called authentic compassion. Compassion that comes not from obligation or spiritual idealism, but from genuine understanding of the human condition. When you've faced your own shadows and healed your own wounds, when you've seen how unconscious patterns can control even well-intentioned people, when you've experienced the difficulty and the possibility of transformation, you develop a deep appreciation for how challenging it is to be human. This authentic compassion extends not only to your mother but to all the people in your life who are struggling with their own unconscious patterns, their own unhealed wounds, their own inherited programming. You begin to see that everyone is doing their best with the resources they have, that everyone is carrying invisible burdens, that everyone deserves understanding and support in their journey toward consciousness and healing. This doesn't mean becoming naive or failing to protect yourself from harmful behavior. Authentic compassion includes discernment, the ability to see clearly what is happening and to respond appropriately. But it does mean recognizing the difference between the person and their patterns, between someone's essential nature and their unconscious programming, between who they are and what they've inherited. As you continue on this path of healing and growth, remember that the goal is not perfection but consciousness. You will continue to have moments when the old patterns reassert themselves, when you react from childhood programming rather than adult wisdom, when you struggle with the same issues you thought you had resolved. This is normal and expected. It's part of the ongoing process of integration. What changes is not the elimination of all challenges, but your relationship to them. Instead of being unconsciously controlled by patterns, you become consciously aware of them. Instead of automatically repeating inherited behaviors, you can choose how to respond. Instead of being a victim of your history, you become the author of your ongoing story. Jung believed that this ongoing process of consciousness and choice is what makes human life meaningful. We are not just biological organisms driven by instincts and conditioning. We are conscious beings, capable of recognizing our patterns, healing our wounds, and creating new possibilities for ourselves and future generations. Your mother complex, with all its challenges and gifts, is part of what makes you uniquely you. It has shaped your sensitivity, your struggles, your strengths, and your capacity for transformation. It has prepared you for work that only you can do, for relationships that only you can create, for contributions that only you can make. The invitation now is to step fully into this unique role, not as someone who has been damaged by their past, but as someone who has been initiated by it. Not as someone who needs to be fixed, but as someone who has developed wisdom through experience. Not as someone who is broken, but as someone who has been broken open to greater love and consciousness. This is the ultimate gift of working with the mother complex, the discovery that your wounds can become doorways, that your struggles can become strengths, that your pain can become a source of healing for others. You become what Jung called a wounded healer, someone who can guide others through difficult territory because you've walked that path yourself. The world needs wounded healers now more than ever. It needs people who have done the difficult work of facing their shadows, healing their wounds and transforming their patterns. It needs people who can hold space for complexity and paradox, who can offer authentic compassion born from their own experience, who can model what it looks like to live consciously in an unconscious world. Your mother complex, far from being just a personal problem to be solved, is actually preparation for this larger work of healing and service. The very patterns that have caused you the most difficulty are also the ones that will give you the greatest authority and authenticity when you step into your role as a conscious ancestor, a wounded healer, a guide for others who are struggling with similar challenges. The journey continues, but you no longer walk it alone. You carry with you the wisdom of your own experience, the support of others who have walked this path, and the knowledge that your healing contributes to the healing of the world. You have become what you once needed, a source of understanding, compassion, and hope for yourself and others. And in that becoming, the mother complex transforms from a source of suffering into a source of service, from an inherited burden into conscious wisdom, from a wound that weakens into a sacred opening that connects you more deeply to your own heart and to the hearts of all beings who share this human journey of growth, healing, and awakening. The mother who lives within you, no longer the wounded, controlling, or absent figure of your childhood, but the integrated, wise, and compassionate presence that you have learned to embody, now blesses your journey forward with love that liberates rather than binds, wisdom that illuminates rather than confuses, and strength that empowers rather than overpowers. You are home, not in the house of your childhood, but in the home of your own conscious, loving, authentic self. And from this home, you can love freely, live fully, and contribute meaningfully to the ongoing human story of transformation and awakening. This is your inheritance, this is your gift, this is your calling. Use it well,